Welcome to the Brad Link Podcast, your home for expert wedding planning advice. Today we've got Destinee with Rothchild Catering here to go over your must-ask questions for your caterer. That way you know before you call for your initial consult, you don't miss a beat on all of the planning that you should do beforehand. So hi Destinee, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm so excited to be talking about catering today. At Rothchild Catering, we're so passionate about food. It's great to share our advice.
Yeah, and I really think that if we go over a few things so they're a little bit more educated before they do that initial phone call, they'll get more out of that initial phone call than they would if they just call you right off the bat knowing nothing.
Absolutely. Brides, couples in general are talking to so many wedding vendors during their planning process. If they can be prepared when they give us a call, they are going to get so much more out of that first phone call and hopefully save themselves some time.
And as a wedding vendor, I know that usually when I get contacted, one of the first questions they ask is, what's the price? And I know there's just so much that goes into catering. You can't just initially go back with a quote without asking quite a few questions. So, first, I wanted to talk about just the different types of catering. I know there's full service, there's drop off, and that really can impact the price a lot. So, can you talk a little bit about what a different style of catering is going to do to your initial quote and what questions you need to be aware of with that?
Absolutely. So we do full service catering, which means that we have a staff that we can send to a wedding reception. They're going to be responsible for the setup, the bussing the tables, making sure the food's maintained, and cleaning up afterwards. We do get requests for drop off service, and that is something that we will provide, but we like to educate our clients and make sure that they have designated people responsible for the other duties that usually come along with full service catering. So whenever someone calls and asks about the style of food service, I usually like to ask them a few questions and gauge whether or not they do need a service staff or whether they can actually have just drop off and be fine.
Because definitely trying to save the money and do drop off catering, they don't realize how much work they're signing themselves up for sometimes.
Yes, a lot of people, they think that they'll get the food delivered, people will eat it, and then that's the end of the situation. But
hmm
nobody wants to work on their own wedding day. So somebody has to be designated to clean up those plates and scrape them off and put them away and make sure they're returned to where they came from.
Our company probably does 100 weddings a year. And I always have people that are like, our guests are really great. They're going to bust their own tables. They'll know to throw away their own plate. And usually they don't, just because it's not typical at a wedding. A lot of times the service is a little bit higher. I've had one wedding out of all of the weddings that we've ever done where all the guests bust their own plates.
Wow, that would be a sight to see for
Yeah.
sure. A lot of people, if they are doing disposable, that's a whole nother ball game. But when you're talking about ceramic plates and stainless cutlery, linen napkins, all of that, those are items that are going to have to be returned. So there's a little bit
Mhm.
more that goes into them. And most rental companies have policies about how those products need to come back to them.
Mhm.
So you want to make sure that that's getting back so you're avoiding charges.
Mhm. So, what are some common misconceptions just about catering and pricing in general?
A lot of clients assume that catering is like a restaurant and that catering should cost the same as a restaurant meal or maybe even less because you're ordering for high quantities of people. But catering is so different from a restaurant. At a restaurant, they have set menus. They know what they're serving every day. They can look at the numbers and say, oh, we go through this amount of potatoes in a week. And they're able to order food quantities from their suppliers that they get a good price on because they know they're going to sell it. But for a caterer, our menus are different every day, every week, from every client. So we aren't able to order quite as much at one time because we might not need that you might need it for one day and then you might not need it for 2 more weeks after that. So we're not able to get that great bulk discount on our food products as much as a restaurant can. And we have so much more involved as far as logistics go with traveling because we are mobile. So we're traveling, we're loading equipment, we have to, charge for, we're paying for that gas that's getting us to the venue, etc. So there's a lot more that goes into catering than a restaurant that operates the same each day.
Mm-hmm. I do not envy your position because that sounds like one giant word math problem to me to figure out a catering
Yeah,
quote with all of that.
yeah, it is. It really is.
Do you all have a lot of people that are looking at different dietary restrictions when they're talking to you about a custom menu?
We do. I've noticed that people are starting to be inclusive with their menus.
Hmm.
If they have a lot of guests that are gluten free or vegan, vegetarian, they're taking that into consideration when planning their menu from the beginning. But we do have clients that they might have one or two vegetarian guests, and we get asked about that. Can you do a specific plate for vegetarian guests? Absolutely, we would be happy to, because we want everybody to have delicious food and make sure that everybody is taken care of. So we get that question a lot. We're always happy to help. And sometimes a menu will actually lend itself to being perfectly fine for that guest if they are looking for a vegetarian meal and one of their options on their menu is pasta with flame roasted vegetables. That in itself can be a side or an entree. As long as you have enough to make a full meal out of it, then that's usually my recommendation.
Mm-hmm. So, if a guest happens to be concerned about dietary restrictions just when they're at a wedding, what should that guest do?
They should certainly seek out someone on the catering staff and ask them, because they're going to have the correct information. We try to make it a priority that while all of our menus are unique, we try to be consistent with how we create our sauces and prepare our vegetables. That way, the server is educated on what is in that dish so that they can tell the customer. And sometimes we will put food signs if but it's not always requested
Mm-hmm.
because people don't like the look sometimes of having the signage. So in that situation, you'd want to ask a staff member. Otherwise, we'll put it on the sign whether or not it's gluten free or vegetarian.
Mm-hmm. As a wedding planner, I always make the guests talk directly to the catering staff because I don't want to misremember something and give them the wrong information and say like, "Oh, there's no peanuts in this,"
Mhm.
and there's definitely peanuts in it, or
Yeah.
something like that. So I feel like the catering staff is the expert
Hmm.
on what's in the food, and so I just have the guests talk to one of the lead staff members so that way we know that we're giving them all the correct information.
We ask our clients to tell us in advance whether or not there's somebody with a food allergy or a restriction. Even if we're not creating a custom plate, even if there's enough on the menu for that guest to eat, it's important that we're aware of it. That way, if someone asks, our staff knows, what they're talking to them about, whether it's gluten free or dairy free, etc.
Hmm.
That they're aware that there is somebody in this room that needs to know the answer to this question, and I'm going to prepare to answer it before I go.
Hmm. So other than that, what do you see as some other trends that people are asking for? They need to be prepared with questions for, just in catering and food in general.
Food stations have kind of been an up and down path for a while in
Mm-hmm.
catering. I still think that they are a trend because I'm seeing a lot of people ask for dessert bars instead of just doing the big wedding cake. Some people,
Yes.
yeah, absolutely, and everybody loves that because they get to pick what they want. Maybe they're a chocolate person, maybe they'd rather have the fruity dessert. So a lot of couples are opting for the token cake that they can take the picture cutting, and
Mm-hmm.
then they might have some cookies under a warmer or cheesecake bites, something that appeals to a variety of taste.
Mm-hmm. As a wedding planner, I'm definitely pushing that just because not everybody likes cake.
Yeah,
And if you have a dessert budget, why wouldn't you spread it out and do a few different types of treats so everybody gets something they like, but also you spend money on stuff that's actually going to get eaten?
right. And you can make such a pretty display out of it when
Mm-hmm.
you have all of those different desserts and they come in different containers and they have different shapes and all this stuff. It makes such a beautiful, aesthetically pleasing display for your dessert table. And of course, everybody loves when things are pretty.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a big benefit to the dessert tables.
So if I were to call you as a bride or groom and just say, "Hey, are you available on my date?" What goes into answering that question?
It's funny you ask that because that is usually the first question that a client will ask me. And it's difficult to answer unless I have some information about the wedding. So, knowing the guest count and the style of service would be the two most important points of information for me to start a quote because the style of service and the guest count usually dictate the number of resources we need or the number of servers, the number of equipment, chafing dishes, etc. So when I look at the calendar and there's other events on that day, I need to know how many resources you need for me to tell you if we have them. And if a client will come to me prepared with those just those two small pieces of information, I'm much better able to answer their question.
hmm Again, that sounds like one big word math
Yeah.
problem to me. So I definitely don't envy that. I think that really when you're talking about day of logistics, there's so much that you guys need to know that people just need to be prepared to call you and have a full on conversation, not just shoot off a few questions and expect a quote back, in 10 or 15 minutes.
Absolutely. People are planning weddings so far in advance these days. I'm getting quotes right now for a year in advance plus, and people seem to think that catering is one of the first things that they need to book, and that's not necessarily the case because caterers can usually do more than one event per day,
hmm
and other wedding vendors can't, such as a venue, sometimes a photographer, a DJ. So for catering, they can actually wait until they have a little bit more information figured out. That way, they can come to the caterer and get an accurate quote by knowing what's there. So there's there's a lot that goes into the day of logistics that somebody calling a year and a half in advance might not know at that point.
hmm I think day of logistics is just such a big topic that we should just do another podcast that covers all of it because there's so much that goes into it and so much that people don't think about that can
Mm-hmm.
really, really mess up
Yes,
the day if it's not planned correctly. So I think we should go over that in another podcast.
that sounds like a great idea because there's a lot.
Okay, so for more expert wedding planning advice, you could always follow us at thebradlink.com. And if you want more information about Rothchild Catering or to have just a conversation about your wedding, you can reach out to them and we'll put their information below so you can follow a link just to get contact information. Follow us on thebradlink.com.